It started out with an idea to make a documentary. Now, with over 60 interviews completed and more to record, it's time to listen fully.
These are the stories from those who experienced the Young Religious Unitarian Universalist program.
All right, so I'm just going to say the date of that. It is September 4th, 2025, and we are with Meg Riley. Meg, can you say your full name of how you like to introduce yourself and what titles you like to give yourself? Yeah.
Oh, I love to give myself all kinds of titles. Um, I'm Meg Riley. I am Reverend Meg Riley. I could say I was Dr. Meg Riley because I have an honorary doctorate from Star King, but I won't. I'm no longer co-moderator Meg Riley. I'm pretty much just Meg Riley now.
It's amazing. So I think I might just start by getting a little bit of your background in how you found yourself into the Unitarian Universalist faith. Did you grow up in it? Did you,
Yeah.
all that? Yeah. So go
Yeah.
ahead. Yeah.
Okay, so yes, I grew up Unitarian Universalist in Charleston, West Virginia, and Akron, Ohio. I grew up when LRY was kind of disintegrating. So my older brother and sister were super involved with it and went to all the conferences. And by the time I came along, the districts were kind of stopping having conferences, and there'd been a lot of drug use, and they were mad about it. And so I was kind of there for the disintegration of LRY. But my youth group in church in Akron was super important to me and really kind of the center of my emotional life because my high school wasn't. And so, yeah, it always meant a whole lot to me.
So can you describe sort of the Meg having to go to high school and then the Meg at youth group? What was the difference
Yeah.
between, yeah.
Well, my high school was an urban school where white flight was in action, and it was, the popular, like the prom king, and the cheerleaders were black. I mean, it was turning into a black school. And so I was in this tiny little group of white people that were tracked into classes for college prep, but they were ending. It was turning into a VOTEC. So it was kind of just a weird cultural experience, my high school. So I hung out with the people that were called the freaks at the time, that were the artists and the hippies, and we hung out in the art room all the time. And at what I loved about YRU, starting with junior LRY and senior high, is that the gender stuff, I didn't know yet that I was a lesbian. I was trying to figure all that out, not very actively, just kind of trying to avoid it actually. But the boys and the girls really hung out in a different way at the youth group. You could really, I mean, we did about your sexuality together. You could really be friends with boys there, and I really liked that. It was very different than school that way. Although the freaks were kind of like LRY, but a tiny subset of high school. But I just felt comfortable with the kids at youth group. We talked about important stuff. We had really good advisors, a young couple. There was one really creepy guy who turned out later to go to jail for pedophilia, who was one of the advisors, and we were all totally creeped out by him together. And so that kind of brought us together. I don't think he ever molested anyone there, but he just said creepy things that we all couldn't stand him. At that time, you'd say to your parents, Dr. Moore is really creepy. And they'd be like, oh, get over yourself. So it wasn't a time when parents particularly listened to their kids. So anyway, yeah, I was much more comfortable in general. Also, like in junior high, I tried to be popular. I tried to hang out with the popular kids. And when I was in the ninth grade, Kent State happened, and I lived in Akron, which is 20 miles from Kent. And this popular girl that I was trying to be friends with, who was beautiful and a cheerleader and stuff, she was like, my dad said they should have shot more of them. And I was just like, oh my God, my values are so different from yours. And also that was when I was in junior high, Martin Luther King got killed and Robert Kennedy Jr. got killed. And so it became really clear to me that I shared values with the other kids at church where we would go and sit and cry about these things as opposed to thinking it was good. So it just, by high school, I knew that those were my people in terms of values. And in West Virginia, when I was a little kid, it was really clear that those were our people as a family because we were such misfits. We were, my mother worked. She was the only mother who worked. She worked in civil rights. My God, that we don't, in 1965, we sold our house to Black people. I mean, so we always felt like we could relax and breathe at church and I couldn't at school or anywhere else. So yeah, it was always a refuge to be able to go to church.
I'm gonna come back to the idea of of hanging out with the popular kids, in terms of what it meant to be popular in YRUU, so I'm going to come back to that. I'm just
Okay.
going to make a note of that. You're in your Akron youth group. Did you go to wider conferences with people throughout the district? Can you talk
Yeah, I
about that?
did. Well, I came along in LRY at a time when I learned when I worked in the youth office, I read the history. For a while, they had a junior high director who actually paid attention to what junior high kids needed. And so we had a summer camp where there was a senior high section and a junior high section. My siblings went to the senior high and I went to the junior high, which was much more structured. And I loved it. And I made friends there from all over. It was called at that point the Greater Ohio District. And then there was the Allegheny Regional Federation. And then they merged, and we called it, they didn't, God Arful. So funny. So I knew kids in Pittsburgh and Youngstown and Columbus, and we would go see each other. We would take the bus and go have reunion, hang out with each other in between. As I said, when the conferences kind of dried up, because adults got mad about some of what was going on, understandably, honestly. But I've been to some really horrible adult conferences, and no one said adults can't have conferences anymore. They just said that was a really badly run conference. So anyway, yeah, so yes, I met kids from all over. And then my older siblings, who I idolized, they hung out with kids from church all the time too. So yeah.
So LRY is sort of dissolving. Can you remind me? So is this around late 70s, early 80s you're
Well,
talking?
LRY dissolved for a long time. I got out of high school in 72. And I
Oh.
don't think national LRY was dissolving, but my district was falling apart.
Wow, so that yes, like okay, so that's it is earlier for some
Yeah,
other dis okay,
yeah,
fascinating. Okay.
yeah. Just like YRU went on,
Yep.
in PCD and some places for a long time after the national. So yeah.
Let's keep moving through time here.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, so you've graduated. Now what? What's going on with your life?
So I went to college out in Portland, and it turned out my roommate was UU. And so we thought, oh, that'll be so fun. Let's go to church together. And we went once and we just hated it. We left. We went to Quaker meeting because they fed us pizza and it was right next to the school. So we did that. And then I moved to Minneapolis after college and I was trying to figure out, should I come out or should I go to seminary? Because it didn't feel like I could do both. And so I was 23, and I went to talk to uh, the minister at the church that I was going to at the time about it. And he said, "You're not a lesbian," and tried to seduce me. At which point I went running out of his house and hung around with lesbians for the next 5 years. I was like, no. So, but then, I wanted to go to seminary still. So it wasn't really 5 years. It was about 2 years that I just completely immersed in lesbian culture. And so then I started seminary and became a director of religious education as I went to seminary. And that's when I started getting involved with the youth movement as a young adult, but an adult.
And so when you became a DRE and you're in seminary, what years are we talking?
So I went to seminary from 83 to 87, and I was a DRE from 85 to 89 at First Universalist Church in Minneapolis.
So I'm gonna backtrack a little bit. Can you go? So you're in Portland. You went with your roommate. What was going on when you went to this church that you hated it so much?
Well, it was actually quite embarrassing. I, the minister, for some reason, was talking about, he very emotionally said to the crowd, I still remember it. He said, "Don't live in square rooms, live in round rooms." And my roommate and I looked at each other and we started to laugh. And then, as used to happen when I was young, sometimes when I started to laugh, I couldn't stop. And we started laughing so hard that we fell under the pews laughing. And then we were so embarrassed that we slunk out of there. We all the way down on the bus, we were like, "Oh, we're going to get to talk to adults. Oh, this will be so fun. Oh, and blah, 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 blah." No, we slunk out of there horrified at ourselves, but also like, what was he talking about? It was a very young adult experience. And I'm sure the people around us thought we were just despicable. But that still happens to me sometimes that I get laughing so hard I can't stop. And I don't know what it was about that situation, but that's why we never went back. I didn't go back till I was the youth advisor, actually, and did our first Renaissance module there. And it was a different minister.
That's
God.
great. I know that feeling in church. I know it. I know it well. So, talk to me about what drew you to go to into seminary.
So, a Beacon book changed my life and told me, A, you're a lesbian, B, you're really interested in theology. It was a book called Beyond God the Father by Mary Daly. I ran into it at a bookstore. I ended up sitting in the aisle reading the entire book and going, oh my God. And it's too bad because now in women's studies classes, all that people learn about Mary Daly is that Audre Lorde wrote her a letter about how racist she was. And she was. It was very white-centered. It was just super Euro-centered. Um, but that book radicalized so many women my age who went to seminary. So many women I talked to were like, because she's doing, like, I had never heard the word patriarchy before. I think it's hard for younger people to envision what it's like to not have the kind of language that we have now. But I just thought it was weird. And she was more radical than I was. And I'd never read anyone more radical than I was about being a woman. So I got interested in theology because she was talking about the political history of the church and how, like, they voted to make Mary into a virgin and, all these things that I didn't know and really interesting. So I decided to take one class and I did, and it was really interesting. And it was at a UCC seminary here in the Twin Cities. And every time I would think, oh boy, I'm going to say something that's going to be so radical because I'm Unitarian. And I'd say it, and all the UCC people would go, yeah, so what? Yeah, we think that too. So I felt pretty relaxed there, but I applied to Star King and they turned me down, which, believe me, I mentioned when they gave me the honor. Yeah, they turned me down because I was too young. They didn't want young people there. And or at least that's what they said to me. I think I was 26 when I applied. And so then after I took that one class, I decided to take two classes, and then I applied to the school to actually get into a degree program. But I didn't want to be a minister. I didn't want to be a parish minister. Believe it or not, I had never heard a woman preach. I mean, it's, I think, again, so hard to conceptualize what it's like to not have mirrors when you've had them. But I still remember the first sermon I heard by a woman, and I remember the whole sermon, not because it was like the most inspiring sermon, because I'd never heard a woman preach before. And so, and much less a lesbian. I mean, I really felt like I had to choose between being a lesbian and being a minister. So I wasn't going to get ordained. But so I was in seminary. I was going to do there was then an independent study program for religious educators. And I thought I was in the closet. It turned out my very first day of work, the whole board discussed the fact that I was lesbian, but no one ever talked to me about it. So I spent 2 years believing myself to be in the closet and then only then learned that I never had been, which is kind of what I think is true of closets in general. But so so then after I started seminary, I liked it. And it was really quite interesting to me.
And then, so you found yourself being a DRE, right?
Mhm.
So talk to me about working with. I'm guessing you worked with all ages in
Yes,
yeah,
all
growing up. Yeah,
ages. Yeah.
yeah. So tell me about
Yeah.
that.
So I was half time, all ages. There were, I am going to say 400 kids in the program and adults. It was a different time. A lot of mothers had a lot more volunteer time than they do now, but still I look back on that and I'm like, oh my God. But so one of the things that I did was youth. And so I went with the youth to a couple of the district conferences. But when I say I went with the youth, and I had quite a large youth group, but only about four of them would go to the district, were at all interested in going to the district conferences. Because the youth in that church, unlike when I grew up in West Virginia, being Unitarian Universalist really meant that you were, as Martin Luther King would say, you were alienated from society in a good way. In Minneapolis, which is progressive, you're not alienated, you fit right in. And so the kids were much more, they were less like freaks. They were less like the art class that I hung out with in high school, and much more like the cheerleaders and the straight A students. I mean, and they weren't looking for what YRU had to offer, which I was. I loved it. So I went to the youth conference and tried to get more of them interested in going, and they weren't. And so actually, when I applied to be the youth director at the UUA, it was because I wanted a ticket to Boston to go tell them that they were missing the majority of the kids by only offering such specialized leadership development for the few. That's exactly why I flew to Boston. And I was stunned to be offered the job because I really went to tell them everything they were doing wrong. And then they were like, yeah, we think so too. Why don't you come and fix it? So yeah, I mean, we would take the other advisor and I would go out on like week-long canoe trips, and we really hung out. I've always liked hanging out with teenagers, and both junior high and high school. My mom was a junior high teacher, and anyway, so but yeah, they were way more wholesome than I ever was at that age. So they were a different kind of teenager than I had known up close and at the UU church. I mean, I'm not saying all the kids at my UU church were as misfitty as I was, but we were quirky. We were quirky people. So um more arty and you know, yeah, just more edgy. So yeah, but that wasn't true where I was the DRE.
So, as you travel to these conferences with the few, you said only a few wanted to go to the larger,
Yeah.
yeah. Um, uh, and you were advisors sleeping on the floor of churches, I'm guessing, and all that stuff. So, can you describe sort of what it's like to be an adult in that space, supporting the youth, encouraging them, and letting them lead?
Yeah. Well, I feel like I learned a lot more about that as youth programs director because then I had the two youth program specialists with me who would get right in my face whenever I was too bossy or too adulty. And I learned a lot from them about, hey, keep your mouth shut, let a youth say it. And I'm grateful for that because that's true in a lot of environments that keep your mouth shut is the best advice. Um, so mostly because so few kids that I knew were at those conferences, I didn't know the leaders. They were from other parts of the district. It was a huge district. They were from like Nebraska and, so I'd only see them for 2 days here or there. And they they were like a different speed. They reminded me of my own high school, but it didn't carry into my church. And when I would say, we would take like a bus down there, it wasn't like a few of us in a car. And I would say, like, because some of the other churches here sent more kids, but I'd be like, hey, what do you think about doing what they're doing? And they'd be like, no, we don't have time for that. So it didn't really carry back to my church. Or if I'd say, hey, what do you think about encouraging more people to come to the next conference? They'd be like, no, I don't. Most of them would go once and not want to go again because they were alienated there. And that's what I went to tell Boston about when I went. Like, you're alienating a lot of people. So, because I have to think, even though Minneapolis is a progressive city, so probably in more conservative places, the church does attract more countercultural kids. There are trends in how kids are in the world. And I felt like by the time, by this time it was late 80s, it was a different time with the way that youth and adults interacted than when I was young, it was the generation gap. And we didn't talk to our parents about much of anything. And nor did we expect them to know about our lives. That had really changed by the time I was a DRE. Parents were much more involved in their kids' lives. So, and of course, now it's changed a million times over.
You get the opportunity to become the youth programs director, right? And so you saw this. So you tell me more about this situation with you saw the interview and you're like, well, I'm gonna go tell them what I think. So tell me about that whole process and just or what you want to share of it. And
Yeah.
yeah.
So this thing called the REACH packet used to come out to religious educators. It was the Religious Education Action Clearinghouse, and it came out of Boston every quarter, and it was a whole bunch of resources, including job opportunities. And it happened to come on a day when I was pretty disillusioned with the leadership in my church, and I thought, I'm just going to apply for this. And uh, both so then to my surprise they were interviewing me, and then even more to my surprise my then partner agreed that she would actually move to Boston if I got that job, because she was born and raised 2 blocks from where she lived in Minneapolis. I never thought she'd leave. So I decided, having tried to be in the closet at the church, I was like, I'm going to be completely out in this interview. I am not doing that again. And I was, and people were kind of like, yeah, whatever, we don't care, just like, that's fine, whatever. And so, yeah, at the time you flew out, you stayed at Pickett Elliott, and then you interviewed with, um, it was Gene Navius was the director of the Department of Religious Education. Judith Meyer was his boss. She was the vice president for programs. And then Ellen Brandenburg had been the youth program director, but I think she had already moved on to her new job, so she wasn't there. And then there was, trying to remember, only one of the youth program specialists was in the interview, and then someone from the steering committee. So it was a big group of people interviewing me. And I was just real and myself, and including telling them what I thought was wrong. And I remember they said, well, how will it be to have equal power with the youth? And I said, I don't believe I will. In this world, that will never happen. I'm sorry. I mean, we can say I do. We can try to equalize it, but that's not the world we live in. And so I thought, okay, they're probably not going to like me because I said that. But they did. And I remember Kay Montgomery, who was the executive vice president, who actually called me to say I had the job. After I said yes, she said, oh, good, because there was no one else. We wanted it all. Everyone, you were head and shoulders above everyone. And I've always thought it was because when I walked into the office, Ann Sontheimer, who was now Ann Sontheimer King, who was one of the YPSs, was listening to the singer Farron, who happened to be my favorite singer. And I was like, oh my God, Farron! And I had just seen her in concert, and I started raving about her to Ann. And then I remember Ellen Brandenburg, who was in the office, said, does she talk like she sings? And Anne and I like her. You don't have to, you know. So I always felt like I bonded with Anne immediately because we loved the same musician. But anyway, so yeah, at the time it was Anne and this guy from Maine named Jason. And truthfully, when I arrived, I didn't know what was going on, and they just kind of kept me focused. And like at the time, I had never been to youth council. I'd never been to ConCon. I was hired to start after General Assembly in New Haven, but I went to General Assembly in New Haven still from Minneapolis. And of course, everybody wanted to talk to me about this new job, but I didn't know anything. And so, like, I was not an insider. I was not a YRU insider at all. I was a DRE, which I quickly learned was kind of the enemy. I hadn't realized how much DREs really were the enemy. And so, but when I started, so I just was kind of like, Anna and Jason, what do we do next? What's going on? Because I started July 1st and we had youth council and ConCon, which they were doing all the work for that, you know, and I could barely keep them straight, which was youth council, which was ConCon, what was the difference? You know, I mean, I just was like fumbling along behind them. So very quickly, the joke that I was the real power was clear to me. Like, actually, right now, you don't know anything, and you are completely dependent on those two. And they were great, as all the youth staff were that I worked with. They really carried the load wonderfully. Um, and yeah, so then we went to Michigan for youth council and ConCon, and I mean, truthfully, I fell in love. I mean, I just felt like the young people there were so amazing and such good leaders, so responsible. I mean, so much more faithful than so many of the adults I'd known in Unitarian Universalism. Yeah, I fell in love with the whole thing.
I we have your the article we get to put in there in our mug book, the we put in the enough to get in the way. Yeah, right.
Hmm.
And there's a quote in here that you kind of you basically you describe what the R in YRUU is.
Hmm.
So what was the R, the religious in YRUU?
The worship, Jocko Tenhove, who I'm sure you've interviewed, was doing the worship and with the youth. And he was really good at it. And it was just such deep and profound and vulnerable sharing. Um, Unlike many adult communities I'd been in with Unitarian Universalists, there would be people who would lose their jobs so they wouldn't come to church so other people wouldn't know it, adults. Whereas the youth would really just pour their hearts out. And I was very moved by it because I thought, this is trust. This is youthful idealism, sure, but this is a trust in one another and the power of community that I, coming out of the lesbian community and the you know progressive community doing organizing around Native American issues and other things, I knew that in a different world than Unitarian Universalism, where I feel like the white middle classness of it really could take over the culture. But the youth culture was stronger than that. And it was a faith that I recognized and I wanted. And yet I was there as an adult, right? So it wasn't really for me. Um, and I never felt unclear about that. I never felt like you're my new best friend. But I did feel like you're what I want the faith to be. You are holding the faith. Um, and really, honestly, that has kept me through a lot of less inspiring times. Um, yeah, I mean, it could get silly. Like I remember one youth worship where some kid in somebody's school had committed suicide and they cried about it and they lit a candle and there were all these candles. And so then everyone started talking about someone who had died. And then you know how it can get. And it was going on for hours and hours and I was really tired. It was like 1 in the morning and I was desperate to get up off the floor and go sleep. And then people started blowing out other people's candles and lighting a new candle and I was like, no. So it could get it could get a bit much for me. But at the same time, the desire to be seen and known and I think that's what I talk about in that article is just the willingness to risk. The willingness to risk really, really, to me, is what faith is about, right? In the name of love, being willing to risk.
That's great. I always wonder, what is the internal monologue of the adults, like how do you check yourself of saying, wow, this is ridiculous, but wow, they're
Yeah.
having a great time.
Yeah.
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 Yeah,
Luckily it was dark and I was in the back, but I believe I might have dozed off at some point.
as you're seeing these youth that are helping guide you and coming up with how you can figure out what's going on with this program and how it works. I'm going to circle back to the idea of the popular
Mm,
kids and
mhm.
how did that show up in Why Are You You?
Mhm.
At those national conferences. Yeah, like for me, it always was like the leaders, of course, were the ones we were
Yeah.
like, oh, they're so amazing, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And so tell me about that and how it maybe have been different than what it would look like in high school, or was it the same? Not in your high school, but just in any
Yeah.
high school in
Yeah. In
general.
any high
Yeah, yeah,
school.
yeah.
I mean, I think they were the leaders, the popular kids, because they were the ones who had the megaphone, right? And so one of the things that happened when I was the YPD is that somebody who was very popular, who had been chosen to become a youth program specialist, the two program specialists who were already in the office came to me and said, he's been using the UA credit card for himself. And we had to decide, and believe me, it was one of those late meetings with the steering committee into the night, not to have him come. And it was very painful because he was really popular. And I really respected the young people for seeing beyond that to the ethics of the situation because he was their friend. And um yeah, and his mother was an advisor and I mean it was painful. And one of we always at that point had a junior high kid on at the steering committee, and that kid had been at his church, and so this was like an elder to him who he totally. And I just remember it was just excruciating. I mean, we met for hours to process it until we got consensus, but we did. And I was just impressed with everybody's willingness that popularity wasn't the final arbiter of what was okay, which in a lot of schools, I think popularity does win out over morals. So that I think is one difference. When I came, Jason, the YPD or YPS from Maine, he was a shy. I'm not sure how he was picked because he wasn't your typical. Both he and Anne were introverts, and less like the star of the show. But the other thing that I saw was, and I loved this, and I don't think Sean Ramsey would be upset that I said this. Sean was from Tennessee. I'm trying to remember where, Nashville. Anyway, he was from Tennessee. And he made a homophobic joke at a dinner when he was on steering committee. Hmm. And Adam Late said, that's really homophobic. And he was like, you could tell. It just had never even, what? What are you even talking about? And so I feel like even though he was very popular, kids would call him on stuff. It was a different, I always felt like there was more willingness for people to not just let popularity rule the day, kind of at YRUU. And Sean, later was appalled that he thought that was funny, but like, what did he know? Being a high school kid from Tennessee, he was repeating what everyone there thought was hilarious. And so, um, yeah, I think, I mean, I remember this from LRY. There were two sisters who were older than me who were gorgeous. And like, I remember we had a guitar player singing this Donovan song to try for the sun. And then they started crying and hugging each other. And then everyone started crying. And I was like, I wanted to be them so bad. Like, I just was like, they're beautiful and they're crying and they're hugging each other. And oh my God. And, popularity, they were beautiful. I'm sure they were also popular at school because they were both blonde haired and, traditionally gorgeous. But but the crying and holding each other part wouldn't have happened at school, you know what I mean? And so their popularity was both and. It was yeah, so I always felt like vulnerability was part of popularity at YRU, which is really different from high school where vulnerability was the enemy. That's an interesting question. I've never really thought about it. I was never popular in LRY because I mean I only went really through the ninth grade. I don't think there were conferences when I got older. And it was the older kids, who were popular. Um, Yeah. And I remember my first year at steering committee at youth council when they were electing steering committee and people were giving speeches. And I was like, is this a popularity contest? Because we actually need people who take the work seriously. But everyone who got elected did. I think if they'd gotten far enough to go to youth council, they were going to take steering committee pretty seriously. But it did feel like, oh, that kid will be a shoo-in because he's popular. And the other thing that was different, I mean, I'm maybe other people would have other perspectives, but the kind of mean girl stuff or the clicky stuff, people really did just try to be kind to each other in YRU and in LRY. It didn't feel like only the cool kids can be at this table. Um, I mean, it felt to me like only like because my older sister was in LRY when I was, because it was ninth to 12th, not 10th to 12th. And I certainly didn't go sit at her table because she was older. But so there was age stuff, but I don't think it was, I don't know if people felt like only the popular kids could do something. Because there were some really weird kids who were in leadership. I mean, there were.
I'm trying to find in this book here the breakdown of, yeah, here it is. The structure of YRUU governance. This
Yep.
this whole thing here,
Oh,
yeah.
yes. That because
And
that was brand new when I got there. Yeah.
right, so yeah, so you're coming in, you're like, what is this? So yeah, because so often, just in general, with talking to folks, uh, saying, steering committee or youth council, and I still need to look at this, having
Mhm.
interviewed all these, and I was in Where Are You? I'm like, so,
Yeah.
so you, as the youth programs director, was in charge or kind of the head, not head, but you were helping. See, I can't even say it with
I
like,
know.
how do you even word that? What was your role in making sure that these two things happened? Were you just administrating? Were you keeping
Really,
everyone
the
safe? What was going on?
well, okay, so really the youth program specialists did so much of the work. I mean, on those things. Like yeah, they they got, the deans and and then with ConCon, there'd be a whole staff for ConCon. here was the painful part about being the youth program director, and it is where the power thing is real. If somebody had fallen off a cliff or gotten AIDS or gotten pregnant or gotten addicted to drugs at ConCon, I would have been responsible. And yet I had no power to run the thing. I did not. And so I never slept at ConCon. I would just prowl around at night with a flashlight in terror, especially when we met at the mountain and like I saw somebody sleeping in a sleeping bag right at the edge of a cliff. I was like, oh my God. And so like I always felt like kind of the legal system and the system of YRU were like diametrically opposed. And, I would get calls from parents who were furious about something. And I don't think it would reassure them if I said, well, the youth were in charge of that. Sorry, I didn't really have anything to do with it? And so for them, I would act as if I was in charge of it, but I wasn't. And where it really hurt me and broke down is that, we had all these covenants about sexuality and stuff. I would learn later that staff were all just fucking like bunnies. And and I would be like, but you promised you wouldn't. Well, how much do a 16-year-old's hormones really promise that? I mean, so I mean, it just was, that was the hardest. ConCon was the hardest. Youth Council was more of a business meeting and much smaller. And so, even though I'm sure there was sex there, people really were there to do the work. But yeah, with ConCon, I felt lied to by some of the staff, or at least, if not actively lied to, just not being told a lot of reality. Um, and or it would be things like, how can you not trust us just because we're naked in one sleeping bag? It's like, because you're teenagers. I mean, so yeah, that's where I thought youth empowerment was really hard because it wasn't like if I said to the staff, no, you can't. They would go, oh, well, you're really in charge. So, okay, because I wasn't. They were. So I could say to them, I don't like to be lied to, or whatever I said. And to the extent I had a real relationship with them, they'd be real with me. But I learned a lot of stuff after the fact that no one told me when it was, while we were there. And it also put the youth program specialists in a really hard position because these were their friends. So, so anyway, it was ConCon. When they decided not to have ConCon, I was like, yeah, I get that. I get that because it it just, like we had when I was there during my time, we had to ask a number of youth advisors to leave for being inappropriate. And several of whom talk about popular were super popular. And at, from things that happened at ConCon, and um that was probably the most painful thing to me because at that point I'd always figured if someone was creepy with teenagers, I would know it. And I didn't. I really liked and I would have trusted these people with my kid. And so I realized at that point, no, not all creeps read as creeps. Some of them are just really clueless. I mean, there was this super popular young male who showered with a 14-year-old and then said, nothing happened. And I said, you showered naked with a 14-year-old. That happened. And he goes, but nothing happened. And I was like, we define nothing very differently. So I would have to, but in that case too, with the youth advisors, the staff would meet to talk it through. It wouldn't be just be me saying, get out of here now. And I will say the youth would come through. I never felt like they didn't take it seriously or come all the way through, even if they loved the advisor and it was painful, they would. And that, that those meetings that went deep, deep into the night, that's what happens in community. I mean, that felt real. So that didn't feel like the breakdown. The breakdown to me was like, seriously, I know somebody whose kid got addicted to drugs at a not at a national conference, but at a district one in her district. And she was a religious educator, and luckily she had been to things. She understood that no adult could be blamed for that. But if you had a different adult, I mean, we could have been sued so many times for so many things. We really could have been. And thank God we weren't. But that was just it. I just felt like it was it, how do you do that in this world? How do you create a totally different power system when you live in this world? I don't know. I don't know. Yeah, that was the most painful thing, I think, was just that conflict of values and structure and power and powerlessness, different kinds of powerlessness. So, yeah, nobody to my knowledge got pregnant or AIDS or anything at a con that I was YPD for. But yeah,
Yeah, it's such a, like you said, it was such a different world, such a different way of being together. And
yeah.
um, yeah,
And teenagers aren't legally people, you know? I mean, they're not. They're just not. And so, yeah. But even it was mostly the people having sex. Probably not all, but most of them were probably the 18 to 20-year-olds, so they were legally adults. But um, yeah, and the age range when I was there was 12 to 20. And so, like 2 years in a row, youth council was all about should we change the age range? No, we shouldn't. And I mean, I got it because it wasn't like, I mean, I was responsible for junior high programs and everything else. But that's why I was so excited to learn that when I came up, there was actually a junior high director because it was a different developmental time. There were different needs, and I think that youth council knew that there wouldn't be anybody really to step in if they did say, okay, 12 to 14, which they eventually did, but 12 to 14 isn't here. 20, I think we were 12 to 22, actually. They did, I think, change it to 20 because Si Uyen came along, but it was such a huge age range. Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
And I will say that when I was doing the steering committee, the junior high rep was usually the smartest person in the room. I think because their hormones hadn't whacked out yet. I mean, they just often were like the one who would say the thing that synthesized everything. And, you'd be like, oh, yeah,
Isn't that interesting? Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Thanks so much for all your amazing support for our documentary. Your help in so many ways is super valuable as we keep moving forward. To get these important stories out to everyone around the world, we are now looking for a little more financial help. Please head over to yruu.org. That's all spelled out, yruu.org/donate, and give whatever you can. We really appreciate your generosity.
I was on leadership council when YRU was dissolved, and I begged to be in the room. I had been the youth program director. I was never allowed any access to any of that process. And it broke my heart because I felt like the people who were there, I understood they wanted more control, but I didn't feel like they'd seen the other side of it. And it just broke my heart because and the people that I knew who were in the room, it broke their hearts too. The young people who felt used by it. And so I don't really even know all the details of the end. I do know that I begged to be there and wasn't allowed. And I was doing, the justice work. So technically it wasn't my portfolio, but I just felt like it really and so I said in the Berry Street that a religion without a youth movement, to my mind, is not a religion because it means we don't care. And if I had needed to run as co-moderator, youth programs would have been a huge part of my platform. I'm kind of glad we didn't need to run because what actually was needed when we were there was just to support the leadership with all the change it's going through. And that's what we did. We just kind of laid super low and just were background. But I know that they're trying and that they're doing stuff now, but it did really break my heart that like YRU was dissolved with just nothing. Um, because I'd just seen the power, the power of, even though it was frustrating to me to be legally in charge of something I was in charge of, I had watched the faith be alive. I had just watched, I mean, for instance, so I got there in 1989, totally out as a lesbian. I felt nothing but love and support from everybody, the whole time. There was not like, oh, even the kid with the homophobic joke, he just, I don't think he even knew what the word queer meant, like, I mean, it always felt to me like the youth were the cutting edge of the movement. And to not have that kind of leadership, which on the board, we're supposed to have two. We had two our first year, and then no one ever came through again. And it's because you had to apply as a sophomore in high school and be there as a junior, senior. And what sophomore in high school really is thinking about the UUA board? I mean, and like one of the people there the first year was like, I'd be happy to stay, but the bylaws were like, you can't be in college and stay. So I feel like, there's stuff that hopefully will get fixed at the UUA about getting more youth into leadership. Because those youth, when they were on the board, really made a difference energetically and just the way that they would see the world. And the Article 2 Commission, we had two young people who started as seniors in high school and did go to college, and they made such a difference. It was so good to be with, you know, a multi-generational look at who we are. And yeah, I just feel like I mean, that's why I'm really glad you're doing this because we're not a religion if it doesn't include young people, in my opinion. It's just not a religion. And I know at my church here, where I used to be the DRE, I go back there now since I moved back to Minneapolis. The youth are really part of the community in a really good way. And like when they have they do their statements of faith, like the whole church turns out, it's huge. And um, yeah, I like that. It's not just the parents. It's like everybody's like, oh, wouldn't miss it, and because understand that seeing things fresh is so important. So yeah, cut to now. I mean, we would meet while I was co-moderator and we would talk about, because we'd start with the nominating committee. Why can't we get youth on the board? And they'd be like, well, it's really a cultural issue. And partly it was we came in during COVID. No young person was looking for more Zoom meetings. Nobody of any age was looking for more Zoom meetings. And so it wasn't like they got to come to Boston 3 times a year and, and then go home and forget about it. It was like come and Zoom every month. So I understood it, but I hope it'll change. I hope the new leadership will bring a structure in that works so that youth come. Anyway, that's kind of bringing it up to date, but um, I know I was disappointed not to be interviewed for the movie. Um, uh, but then Carrie McDonald was like, yeah, because you'd tell him everything the UUA is doing. And I was like, kind of. So then I was kind of glad to wait because, and it's not to trash them. They've got a lot on their plates. They're changing culture in a whole lot of ways. And I know there are people working really hard around youth. But starting over when it's been so long is just really much harder than because, as we've both said, where you get inspired is by seeing the youth a little older than you, and then you want to come into leadership. And you know, and I don't know if you're interviewing Elizabeth Wynn, but before she went to the UA, where she isn't anymore, she works with immigrants now and what's going on. But I interviewed her when I was doing the Berry Street, and she said the way she defines leadership is who do you leave behind you as a great leader? That's your legacy. And um, I said, God, oh, I wish everyone thought of leadership that way. Where did you learn that? And she said, from the youth movement. And I went, of course you did, because the leadership is always changing. Just the minute you have the perfect leader, they're gone, they're done, they're over. And so there has to be that constant teaching and mentoring and yeah, and breaking that and then trying to start it up again is just hard. Yeah.
Mm.
Well, I just went off on a diatribe that you didn't ask about, but anyway.
No, it's fantastic.
Hi everyone, it's Lindsay. I wanted to jump in here to tell you that we are having a con-inspired connective retreat November 20th to the 22nd on Cape Cod in Massachusetts. This is co-directed by myself and Reverend Jason Leiden, with our weekend musician Matt Meyer. Many of the people you will hear on this podcast plan to be in attendance and even help lead some of the activities. We are taking reservations now. When you head to our website, yruu.org, click on Connective Retreat. It's time to connect. See you there.
This kind of goes back to something you said earlier that I wanted to circle back to. And is this maybe, this was the statement you said is the DREs were the enemy. Do you think that was true throughout all of YRUU's time, that the DRE was the enemy? Tell me more about what that statement is.
Well, I was hurt and surprised when I learned that because I thought we were friends. And I mean, not me personally, but my people, the DREs. And I think what was true is that in a lot of systems, the DREs were the ones saying this is out of control because of that conflict I was talking about, with kind of legally being in charge. And so, and some of the DREs didn't really appreciate youth culture, I would say that. But no, if someone talked about a DRE, generally they were saying something negative about control. And and I didn't know that, you know. Um and I think I do like more control than some of the youth advisors, right? So when I went to run the Washington office, for instance, Jory Agate was then the youth program director. She and I started a conference together in Washington, D.C. that I said, this is for the kids who will never go to a con. This is more structured. It's about how the government works. They go lobby. We have speakers because we were doing adult conferences about that. And I was like, and it was great. We did it for a couple years. It was really fun. And then Jory moved on and Jen took over. And Jen didn't like it. She immediately turned it into being something much more like everything else. It wasn't in Washington, D.C. It was grassroots. It was youth led. And I was like, that's fine, but I just thought a different model also to attract different young people would be an addition. And so I was disappointed that my last year I drove shuttle. Nobody ever asked me. I ran the Washington office. No, nobody ever asked me to do a thing except drive shuttle. And I feel like at that point I was seen as not the enemy, but just irrelevant. In that system where the youth are totally in charge, the adults, I mean, I remember the youth being really angry that adults didn't have to pay to go to conferences. They were like, why do they get to go free? And I was like, because they're working. And they were like, what do you mean they're working? Like, they're not working. And so there's just you know, just a fundamental disagreement about roles. Yeah. And then because what I saw was too often adults abdicated responsibility because they didn't know how to stay in the room in youth empowerment and still be part of the conversation. And that's when it would, in my opinion, go off the rails. But if you make them pay to come, they're going to go to workshops in tie-dye. Why the hell should they be working? You know what I mean? Like, so there's just a real, it is an adolescent view of I'm an adult when you're not. I mean, you're really not quite. And some, like at the Washington thing, nobody said, I want to lead this workshop. We had expert, it was just a different kind of structure. And it was a whole different group of kids who came for whom that would look good on a college application or whatever, why ever they came, I don't know. But but it was interesting because when we did that, three kids from my old church in Minneapolis turned up for that. And I was like, those are the kids who would never ever go to the one that Jen ran. They just wouldn't. So, I mean, it'll be interesting to see now what models actually work in this time. I have no idea. Community is desperately needed that's not phone based. I mean, and I think camps are still going strong, thank God. Um, but yeah, I don't getting young people to commit to a weekend. I don't know what you'd need to promise to make that tempting at this point, or to make it tempting for adults to want to be there and help. So, it's going to be something totally new. Um,
And do you see this coming soon? Do you see the work happening? Do you see like what's your prediction?
I mean, I know that people have been at work. What I haven't seen is numbers. Like General Assembly, there used to be hundreds of young people there. Charles and I were like, yeah, we'll meet with you. How many of you are there? Like it's not the force. It used to be if the youth caucus thought something at GA, whoa, and you didn't try to do anything without going to the youth caucus and getting them on board. And there just isn't I don't know because everything's, breaking apart and changing now. And people are, I don't know. I don't know where the response is coming in. I don't think Zoom meetings is where the response is going to come. I think it's going to have to be face to face. Um, Maybe more regional or clusters or something. I did hear that the international um meetings have been big, and that I thought was exciting and encouraging. Um, and makes sense to me in terms of where we are as a country and world. Um, yeah, I don't know. Because I know even young people in college, unless they're in small colleges, if they're like at university now, they still are doing a lot of phone and less in person. When I was in college, we stayed up all night and talked about the meaning of life, like night after night, right? And I'm like, where's that happening besides TikTok or something? Like I don't know. I hope it is. I hope it is. Because it's so vital. It's so vital. I mean, I do really love staying in touch with the people that I knew when they were teenagers and just seeing so many of them, disproportionate number, become ministers or religious professionals or and it was because of YRU that when I was in the Washington office, I started the internship center for people who had just finished with like who were 22, a little bit older. But it was because of working in the youth office that I was like, it's depressing. George Bush is the worst president ever. Ha ha ha. I need young people's energy. And then, they came and again just did amazing inspirational work. Um, and so I feel like young people are still at it, and a lot of a lot of I mean, really, when I looked out in that room, I was totally overwhelmed because like I just run into Rob Keith and he was in YRU, but he wasn't a YPS when I was there. But he was 50, he was like, I just turned 50. And I was like, Rob, I met you when you were 18, like because he went to college in DC and he came and volunteered at my house. I was running the LGBT office at that point. And just I feel like yeah, I mean, the whole reason that we ended up with the program in Washington, D.C. was young people kept coming and say, well, I want to intern, I want to intern. And I was like, who doesn't want that? And so Peter Morales ended it as he ended a lot of things, but it was good while it lasted. And those young people, a lot of them are ministers, a lot of them are mid-career ministers. I mean, I worked with Parisa Parsa, minister. Rebecca Scott, married to a minister. I mean, just yeah, Adam Late, married to a minister. So, yeah, I love seeing people continue to live out and become middle-aged. But I still see them as the 18-year-old Allison Miller, so many people that I knew when they were little. And they were the same people. That's what I love about it. They were just their leadership skills then and their leadership skills now are just, Joseph Lyons, just continuous. Have you interviewed Joseph, by the way?
Uh-huh. Yeah.
Oh, good. Yeah, he'd
Yeah.
be a good interview.
He
Yeah.
was at General Assembly in Portland,
Uh-huh.
and I didn't know that, and so I found him at the in the exhibition hall,
Uh-huh.
and I was like, "Hi, what are you doing in 20 minutes?" He's like, "Great." I was like, "So that's how it
Yeah.
happened." Yeah.
Yeah. He did logistics at ConCon when we met our youth council. We met in this like Girl Scout camp that didn't have food, and so we had to figure that out. It was cheap though, but yeah, he grew up in Portland and it was nearby, and yeah, that's how I met him. He was doing logistics. But yeah, he's the same person he's always been. And yeah, so I think I mean, I suspect that, again, I haven't seen the movie, but I suspect that the people like him or Allison that you've interviewed who were leaders in YRU and went on to be leaders in the faith credit who they are to what they learned in YRU. Yeah, yeah. And so do I, actually. So do I. I learned to be much more collaborative. I learned to keep my mouth shut. I learned the power of community and risk, um, which I had known in other settings, but not in Unitarian Universalism. But it really changed me to experience it in Unitarian Universalism. And devotion. I mean, the number of young people with YRU tattoos and, just really just giving their whole heart to it. Inspiring, very inspiring.
This podcast was produced by Linden Tree Productions. The interview was conducted by Lindsay Cattle-LaPointe. Music featured by Scott Murphy and Matt Meyer.
For more information, go to yruu.org. That's the question all spelled out, yruu.org.
Don't forget our documentary, YRUU, is available to watch now by renting or buying it through Vimeo. Please subscribe and review this podcast. It will really help more folks find this content.